Michael Miske used to fall asleep to the sound of the ocean in a cliffside mansion overlooking Honolulu, wrapped in silk sheets that cost more than most people's rent, the kind of luxury that made his life look untouchable. Now, the only sound around him is a ventilation system humming and metal doors slamming down a prison corridor as he lies on a plastic mattress inside a concrete cell with a barred window facing nothing but more walls. Bro is 50 years old and just caught 13 federal counts, including racketeering, murder, and kidnapping resulting in death, with a mandatory life sentence just days away. And everyone around him knows exactly how this story ends. This is where he dies, alone in that cell with nothing left but time and the consequences of everything he built. But investigators would later allege that even here, at the very end, Michael Miske was still trying to control the outcome. Not through an appeal or a prayer, but through one final, quiet plan that slipped completely under the radar. The man who spent his whole life running a $30 million empire and deciding who stayed and who disappeared was about to make one last decision, and this time it would cost him everything he was trying to protect. The illusion of control. To understand what Michael Miske became, you gotta understand what made him, because this story doesn't start in a boardroom or in some back alley drug deal. It starts with a 6-year-old shorty standing at a graveside in Honolulu, watching his father get lowered into the ground, a man who had taken his own life by swallowing cyanide, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions in a family that now had to figure out how to survive without him. Hawaii in the 70s and 80s was paradise on the surface and something different underneath. The tourist postcard version with palm trees, crystal water, and aloha spirit was the front page. However, in the back pages and in the streets is where you'd find the real story, where money is scarce and hustle is the only religion that pays. The islands had its own underworld mythology, built around a syndicate called the Company, run by a man named Wilfred Napi Polawa, who ran it like a proper mob. You'd find illegal gambling, prostitution running through the resort hotels, union racketeering, and heroin moving through the docks. He collected tribute from anybody trying to eat in Hawaii and enforced it with a level of violence that became local legend. When 2 Chicago gangsters tried to slide into Hawaii's gambling scene, the Company allegedly murked them both and mailed the bodies back to the mainland. Old school, no games. Pulawa styled himself after Al Capone and eventually got brought down the exact same way: tax evasion. The feds couldn't touch the violence, so they came for the books. By the time young Michael Miske grew up in the working class community of Waimanalo, the Company's power had faded, but the myth hadn't. Older heads whispered about Pulawa the way hood kids on the mainland whispered about Gotti. And for a fatherless teenager with no blueprint, no anchor, and nothing to inherit, that myth was magnetic. The line between fear and admiration? Gone. Erased. When you got nothing, someone who controls everything starts to look like the answer. Miske dropped out of Kailua High School, and the yearbooks from those years don't even list his name, bro. He was already on a different program. By his mid-teens, he was running errands for older street dudes, moving envelopes and packages around Honolulu for small change, stealing bikes, flipping stolen radios at swap meets, learning early that reputation was the real currency on the street, that if you let someone play you once, word gets out and everybody tests you after that. When a rival tried to short him on a payment once, Miske slashed the man's tires, not because it was logical, because he could not stand the feeling of being played. That feeling, that raw, skin-deep refusal to ever be the one who got would follow him for the rest of his life. His rap sheet started stacking up fast. In 1993, he was caught for theft and credit card fraud after moving a stolen car. But instead of doing time, he walked away with probation. Then in 1995, at just 21 years old, he tried to evade a traffic stop, dragged a police officer with his vehicle, and was hit with serious charges including kidnapping, assault, and reckless driving. These were the kind of charges that should have put him away for years, but once again he got probation and no prison time. And right there, Miske learned the lesson that would shape everything that came next. Consequences were for people who didn't know how to play the game. If you had the right lawyers, the right connections, and enough presence to make people uncomfortable, you didn't just survive the system, you walked away from it every single time. It was around this period that he linked up with a man named Rick Calhoun, who was running a pest control operation called Oahu Termite. In pest control, Calhoun took him in and showed him the business, teaching him how fumigation worked, how to bid on contracts, and how to build a steady client base. For a moment, it genuinely looked like Miske had found a real lane, something stable and legitimate, that could have changed his path. Then in 1996, Rick Calhoun vanished. He was never found, the case was never solved, and just like that, he was gone. Within months of the disappearance, Miske had registered the trade names that had been under Calhoun's control, including the tent shop and Kamina termite and pest control. Whether he had anything to do with what happened to his mentor or simply saw an opportunity and moved on it immediately, the outcome was the same. A young man with a felony record and no degree now controlled a functioning pest control business in one of the most lucrative housing markets in America. He rebranded it with intention, calling it Kamina, a Hawaiian term for a long-term locale, someone who truly belongs to the land. It was a smart move. The name alone sent a message that he was not an outsider or a transplant, but someone rooted in the community and worthy of trust. On the surface, everything about it looked legitimate. What people could not see was what was being built underneath that image. Through the early 2000s, Kamina termite and pest control expanded faster than anyone could fully explain. Its white trucks, decorated with cartoon termites and Hawaiian-style branding, became a common sight across Oahu. The company secured contracts to fumigate homes, hotels, schools, and eventually even Honolulu's international airport. One competitor later admitted in federal court that Kamaina's rise was unusually fast, describing it as a company that appeared out of nowhere and quickly grew into a major operation. On paper, it looked like a classic success story, built on hustle and smart marketing. But behind that success, the business was living a double life. Federal prosecutors would later allege that KTPC's headquarters was more than just a business, describing it as the nerve center of a criminal enterprise. In the front office, employees answered calls about termite damage, while further inside, Miske's lieutenants counted drug money and discussed violent operations. The same warehouse that stored fumigation chemicals also held duffel bags filled with illicit cash. Payroll records were manipulated to conceal illegal wages, and government contracts were secured through fraudulent certifications. When customers complained too loudly or tried to avoid paying what they owed, they were not met with reminders or invoices, but with personal visits meant to send a message. To shield himself, Miske kept his name off official documents whenever possible. Other individuals signed papers and appeared as owners while he operated behind the scenes. He built a network of affiliated companies such as Kamaina Holdings, Kamaina Plumbing, Kamaina Energy, Makana Pacific Development, Leverage Inc., and Hawaii Partners LLP. Each business looked legitimate on its own, but together they formed a system that quietly moved money from one place to another. Revenue flowed in through fumigation work, passed through real estate and mainland accounts, and eventually returned to Hawaii, appearing clean. One IRS agent later described the process as chasing shadows, where every lead only created more complexity. Alongside the business, there was also a public display of success that made everything look even more convincing. The M nightclub in Honolulu's Restaurant Row became a centerpiece of that image. It attracted visiting NFL players during Pro Bowl week, local celebrities, and anyone looking to be seen in the city's nightlife scene. The drinks were expensive, the atmosphere was controlled, and Miske himself was at the center of it all. He dressed sharply, arrived in high-end cars, and carried himself like someone who had reached the top. That image was not accidental. It was modeled after a very specific kind of figure, John Gotti. Associates say Miske studied Gotti the way some people study holy texts, the dapper Don's combination of ostentatious wealth and violent authority, the way Gotti played the public persona while running terror beneath it. Miske rehearsed his walk. He ordered custom suits. He sprinkled New York mob slang into his pigeon-like seasoning, creating this hybrid identity, part Hawaiian local, part mainland crime boss, that was entirely theatrical and entirely intentional. Psychologists who reviewed his case suggested the whole performance traced back to those early years. The absent father, the rootless adolescence, the bone-deep need to be seen as someone who could not be played, could not be overlooked, could not be touched. He ran his operation like a franchise. Loyalty was rewarded the way a good plug rewards his riders, generously, publicly, and with strings attached that you didn't always see until you tried to walk away. Employees got Harley-Davidson motorcycles for Christmas, cash envelopes at holiday parties, gold chains given out like handshakes, medical bills covered, rent handled when times got tight. But everyone inside that circle understood the unspoken terms. What he gave, he could take back. A motorcycle repossessed for showing up 5 minutes late. a gold chain, then a slap for talking out of turn. The gifts weren't about generosity. They were about keeping people on a leash they couldn't always feel. Every favor was a debt. Every debt was leverage. Every piece of leverage was control. By the mid-2010s, the empire was stacked deep. Multiple nightclubs, rental properties, a 38,000 square foot cliffside mansion. Between 2010 and 2017 alone, prosecutors would later allege he spent $15.8 million on luxury items, Ferraris, paintings, sculptures, a $1 million fishing vessel called the FV Rachel. He was plugged into Teamsters Local 996, and according to reporting from the Hawaii Free Press, had worked his way into the union's movie unit, taking a cut from film production shooting in Hawaii. He was everywhere. He was untouchable. The feds had been sniffing around for years and kept catching nothing but embarrassment. Drug agents received a tip that Miske was using the FV Rachel to bring cocaine and meth from California, hidden near GPS track buoys dumped in the ocean. They searched that boat top to bottom, found fish. Another time, surveillance picked up chatter about the crew picking up white dog in California. They deployed actual submarines to search the water around the vessel. The crew had literally been talking about somebody's pet, a white dog, a real dog. The feds looked like clowns. Miske knew it and moved with even more confidence because of it. He told people the feds had a hard-on for him, but they kept coming up empty because there was nothing to find. That's what he wanted everyone to think. He wasn't just getting money anymore. He was building something that couldn't be touched. November 17, 2015 started like any other Tuesday in Honolulu. Miske's son, Caleb, who was 21 and married to a woman named Delia, was out with his best friend Jonathan Fraser in a black Honda hatchback. The two of them were part of a close group that included Jonathan's girlfriend Ashley Wong and Delia, who was pregnant with Caleb's child at the time. They made a quick stop at a local vape shop where Ashley saw them from across the lot, spoke to them briefly, and watched them drive off. Minutes later, everything changed. The sound of impact cut through the road as metal collided and brakes screamed. They were moving at around 60 miles per hour when a truck turned suddenly in front of them, leaving no time to react. Both men were seriously injured. Jonathan suffered a head wound, while Caleb's leg was badly damaged. They were rushed to the hospital, and for a while it looked like Caleb might recover. But complications set in as an infection spread from his leg through his body faster than doctors could contain it. By March 2016, just 4 months after the crash, Caleb Miske had died at 22 years old. He had only been able to hold his daughter once before he passed. For Michael Miske, the loss went deeper than grief. It marked a breaking point. Something inside him shifted in a way that could not be undone. He had already lost his father at 6, and much of what he built later in life, the money, the power, the reputation, was shaped by that early loss. Part of it was about filling that gap, and part of it was about making sure his own son would never grow up with that same feeling. When Caleb died, it did more than break him. It removed whatever limits he still had on how far he was willing to go. Grief without direction slowly turned into anger, and that anger settled into something colder and more focused, an obsession that needed an outlet. Miske came to his own conclusion about the crash, relying on his interpretation of seatbelt marks to decide that Jonathan Fraser had been the one driving, not Caleb. There was no official finding to support it and no investigation confirming it, but in his mind that was enough. He moved forward as if it were fact. Publicly, he filed a lawsuit against the trucking company, which looked like the actions of a grieving father trying to make sense of what happened. Privately, he was already moving in a different direction. At first, he kept things calm. He distanced himself from Jonathan and Ashley after the accident, which did not raise suspicion. Then, after some time had passed, he reached out again and invited them to stay with Delia in Hawaii Kai. The gesture made it seem like he was trying to reconnect and move forward. He even spent time with Jonathan, cutting his hair and sitting close with him as if everything had been resolved. From the outside, it looked like an attempt to heal. Later, when he spoke about that moment to his associate, Wayne Miller, he described it very differently. He admitted that while he was standing behind Jonathan, he had to restrain himself from attacking him and dragging him out toward the ocean. That moment revealed how much had already shifted beneath the surface. What looked like calm was actually control, and what looked like reconciliation was part of something being carefully set up. He approached it with patience and intention. Instead of reacting impulsively, he began planning. He brought Wayne Miller in and told him to start thinking through options, to gather people they trusted, and to figure out how it could be done without leaving evidence behind. One idea stayed consistent throughout those conversations. If there was no body, there would be no case. Jonathan Fraser needed to disappear completely. At that point, the situation had moved far beyond business or calculation. It had become personal, and that changed how everything was handled. There was one complication. Jonathan and Ashley were rarely apart. They moved together, stayed together, and with Ashley pregnant, separating them was not easy. For a while, there was no clear opening. Then an opportunity presented itself when Dalia arranged a spa day for Ashley. It appeared casual and unplanned, just a normal outing between friends. While Ashley was away, unaware of what was unfolding, the plan was already in motion. When Ashley came home that evening, something immediately felt wrong. Jonathan's backpack was still in its usual spot. His phone hadn't moved. His vape rack sat on the counter, exactly where he left it. Those were things he never went anywhere without, not once, not ever. Before she could fully process it, she already knew. She searched anyway. She called his friends, spoke to police, reached out to the media, and followed up on every reported sighting from people who believed they had seen him somewhere. Each lead went nowhere. Days turned into weeks, and the reality became harder to ignore. Jonathan Fraser was gone. Later, she put it into words as clearly as she could. We knew that was where he was. He was gone. So finally, for our son before he came into this world, I stopped looking for Johnny. Jonathan Fraser's body has never been recovered. He was 23 years old. In the weeks that followed, Miske met with Wayne Miller and told him it was done. He said Fraser would never be found, and after it happened, he went into the Pacific Ocean to be with his son, saying he had kept his promise. To Miske, it may have sounded like closure. To Miller, it sounded like something else entirely. He took it as a message, a reminder of what Miske was capable of and what could happen to anyone who crossed him. Whether that was intentional or not, that was how it landed. Already dealing with an oxycodone addiction and feeling the growing distance between himself and Miske, Miller made a decision in that moment. He went to federal authorities and became an informant. After years of coming up empty, investigators finally had what they had been missing. They now had someone on the inside who could explain how everything worked and where it all led. And this time, it was not just speculation. Let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because the killing of Jonathan Fraser, as brutal as it was, represented only one part of what federal investigators were trying to uncover. What prosecutors later described as the Miske enterprise operated as a full-scale RICO organization. It stretched across multiple industries at once, using legitimate businesses to hide illegal activity while also using illegal money to support and expand the legitimate side. The violence tied to it was not random or emotional. It followed a structure that people inside the organization understood clearly. Associates described a system built around baseball terms, where first base meant a warning, third base meant a serious beating, and a home run carried a meaning that did not need to be explained out loud. That structure showed up in how conflicts were handled. When a door-to-door salesman casually criticized Miske's pest control business, he later ended up hospitalized. When a competitor running a rival tenting operation clashed with him, their fumigation tents were repeatedly slashed, damaging the core of their business. Ronald Ching, a former MMA fighter, acted as the main enforcer, bringing in other fighters for specific jobs. John Stansel, Miske's stepbrother, coordinated attacks, while Lance Bermudez handled surveillance and transportation. Each person had a defined role, and each role contributed to keeping the operation secure and growing. Beyond physical violence, there were also incidents that crossed into something more extreme. Prosecutors alleged that Miske ordered the release of toxic fumigants inside rival nightclubs. In one case, a woman connected to the group was told to pour what she believed were bottles of pepper spray onto the dance floor of a competing club called Ginza. The substance turned out to be a commercial fumigant, the same type used in pest control, which can cause severe burning, eye irritation, and breathing difficulties. The reaction inside the club was immediate, with people rushing out in panic, trying to clear their eyes and find fresh air. The trigger for that incident was reportedly minor. A rival nightclub owner had posted a lyric from a Jay-Z song online, and Miske took it as a direct insult toward his own club. That response showed how quickly perceived disrespect could escalate and how far his reach extended once it did. With Wayne Miller cooperating, federal investigators finally had a way inside the operation. Wiretap transcripts began to stack up. GPS data placed key associates near Jonathan Fraser's last known location, and forensic teams identified bloodstains in vehicles tied to the group. Financial analysts worked through years of shell companies, falsified payroll records, and laundered money, slowly connecting transactions that had once seemed unrelated. Surveillance teams followed KTPC trucks to understand what they were actually transporting, while undercover officers posed as customers to document extortion as it happened. Piece by piece, the structure that had stayed hidden for years started to come into focus. Miske could feel the pressure building. He had long suspected that his offices were being monitored, so he began testing the people around him. When he told stories, he would change small details like numbers or locations, then wait to see if those altered versions came back through someone else. If they did, he knew exactly where the leak was. It was a method rooted in experience, shaped by years of avoiding law enforcement, and it showed just how aware he was of the risk closing in around him. Even then, the case almost fell apart before it reached trial. Miller had shared sensitive information with two men, James Turtle Salas and Dusky Toledo. Before the trial could begin, both were killed. Salas was stabbed to death in jail, reportedly by members of the La Familia prison gang, while Toledo was shot alongside his brother in a restaurant parking lot in 2023. Witnesses later identified the suspected shooter as someone connected to Miske's circle who had previously been involved in violent jobs. It was never fully proven whether these killings were ordered or coincidental, but the pattern raised serious questions. On July 15, 2020, 5 years after Caleb's death and 4 years after Jonathan Fraser disappeared, federal authorities moved in. Multiple agencies, including ICE, the FBI, the IRS, the ATF, and the EPA, carried out coordinated raids across Hawaii, arresting 11 individuals named in a sealed indictment. The charges covered a wide range of crimes, including racketeering, gun trafficking, surveillance of targets, kidnappings, assaults, chemical attacks, fraud, extortion, witness tampering, and murder for hire. Michael Miske was taken into custody outside a home on Kuna Street, placed into a federal vehicle while cameras recorded from a distance. What had taken decades to build was dismantled in a matter of hours. For years, Miske had operated with the belief that he could not be touched, but the investigation had been building quietly in the background. U.S. Attorney Kenji Price described him as a serious threat to the community, and authorities moved to seize his assets, including properties, vehicles, artwork, and his fishing vessel, with a total value exceeding $20 million. It became the largest forfeiture case of its kind in Hawaii. After the arrest, Miske was held in a federal detention center in Honolulu, where he would spend the next 4 years awaiting the trial that would determine the outcome of everything he had built. United States v. Michael J. Miske Jr. began in January 2024 and stretched across 6 months, becoming one of the longest and most complex federal trials in Hawaii's history. The prosecution built its case through sheer volume and consistency. More than 200 witnesses took the stand, including former members of Miske's inner circle, who had once worked closely with him, handled his money, and carried out his orders. One after another, they described the same system. Wayne Miller testified, followed by Kawina Freitos, Preston Komodo, and Jake Smith, who had even been attacked multiple times in jail while awaiting trial, but still chose to speak. Their accounts aligned in a way that reinforced a single picture of an operation built on fear, strict loyalty, and the understanding that refusing Miske came with serious consequences. Ashley Wong also testified. She sat across from the man she believed was responsible for Jonathan Fraser's disappearance, the father of her child, and spoke about everything she had come to understand in the years since that day. Her testimony carried the weight of someone who had lived with unanswered questions and had slowly pieced together what likely happened. The defense focused on a central weakness in the case. Jonathan Fraser's body had never been found, and they leaned heavily on that point. They challenged the credibility of cooperating witnesses, highlighting their criminal histories and the incentives they had to testify. They argued that Miske was a businessman who had made questionable decisions at times, but not the leader of a coordinated criminal enterprise. Support for him extended beyond the courtroom, with letters from community members, business owners, and religious figures describing his generosity and contributions. Despite those efforts, the prosecution's case held. The jury returned guilty verdicts on 13 of the 16 counts, including racketeering conspiracy, kidnapping resulting in death, murder in aid of racketeering, and attempted murder. The combination of witness testimony, wiretap evidence, financial records, and forensic findings proved difficult to overcome, and the outcome effectively guaranteed a life sentence. Miske remained composed as the verdict was read, sitting at the defense table in a Navy suit and showing little reaction. Behind him, his teenage daughter broke down in tears. Outside the courthouse, reactions were divided. Some people expressed relief and support for the outcome, while others believed he had been wrongly targeted. His presence in the community had been strong for years through sponsorships, donations, and business activity, which made the case feel personal for many. For others, especially those directly affected by the violence tied to the enterprise, the verdict felt long overdue. Following the decision, the case moved into a forfeiture phase. The jury approved the seizure of 27 assets valued at over $20 million, including homes, vehicles, boats, and bank funds. Everything he had built over decades was now being taken apart through the legal system. With a mandatory life sentence approaching, Miske returned to his cell in the federal detention center in Honolulu and began to consider what, if anything, he still had control over. In the months between the July 2024 verdict and what was supposed to be his sentencing date, investigators would later allege that Miske made one final play. 4 years in pretrial custody, 4 years watching his operation get dismantled in open court, his businesses gone, his assets frozen, his people flipping one by one, his name dragged through every newspaper in Hawaii. According to confidential reports submitted to federal authorities during that stretch, Miske had become deeply despondent. He was talking about suicide, telling his attorneys he'd rather be dead than spend the rest of his days in a federal penitentiary. And through all of it, the thing that seemed to weigh on him most was the money. The $20 million the government was moving to seize. What would be left for his family? What the legacy would look like? Here's a man who spent his whole life believing he could maneuver out of anything, that if you planned right and moved right and had the right people in the right positions, the outcome was always negotiable. Now every lever was gone. He couldn't appeal around a verdict backed by 200 witnesses. He couldn't intimidate his way out of a federal prison sentence. He couldn't buy his way out of a forfeiture judgment. Every move that had ever worked for him had gone. The only thing left was the one resource the government couldn't seize: his own life, his own death, his own timing. Federal investigators would later allege, in a civil forfeiture filing dated March 2026, that Miske conspired to have fentanyl smuggled into the federal detention center so he could die by overdose. According to court documents, he allegedly offered another inmate a vehicle, a whole car, in exchange for that inmate violating his release conditions, coming back into custody, and delivering the drugs. Once Miske had the fentanyl, he allegedly took small doses in the days leading up to his death. Not enough to drop him, just enough to build up in his system, enough to make the final fatal dose look like the kind of accidental OD that happens when a depressed inmate gets his hands on something and takes too much. Not a suicide, an accident, untraceable as a plan. The motive, according to prosecutors, was the money. Under criminal law, when a defendant dies before sentencing and before exhausting appeals, a doctrine called abatement ab initio kicks in. The conviction gets nullified. The indictment gets vacated. The whole criminal case evaporates. But under civil law, which governs the forfeiture proceedings, the defendant's death doesn't stop anything. The government can still come for the assets. What Miske allegedly calculated was that dying before sentencing would erase his criminal conviction, and he may have believed that would complicate or block the forfeiture enough to let his family keep something. Die before the sentence drops. Let the law work in reverse. One last exploit. He was trying to cheat the system on his way out the same way he cheated it on the way up. On December 1st, 2024, corrections officers doing morning rounds at the Federal Detention Center found Michael Miske unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The Honolulu medical examiner determined the cause of death was toxicity of fentanyl and parafluorofentanyl. 50 years old, days from a formal life sentence, the man who had styled himself after John Gotti, who had modeled his walk and his suits and his whole mythology with extraordinary intentionality, found dead on a government-issued mattress in a concrete box, with no crew outside the door and no empire left to his name. In February 2025, U.S. District Judge Derek Watson vacated the conviction under the abatement doctrine. The indictment nullified. The criminal case gone. In one of the more twisted ironies in the history of American organized crime, Michael Miske became the only person charged in the so-called Miske enterprise who ended up legally innocent. Every co-defendant who cooperated, every associate who pleaded out, every man who took the stand against him, they're all convicted. MSky is not, but the civil forfeiture case is still very much alive. And in March 2026, federal prosecutors filed a motion alleging that Miske's death itself was an act of criminal obstruction, that the suicide was orchestrated specifically to thwart the forfeiture. and that under civil standards, this entitles the government to proceed with seizing his assets regardless of the abatement ruling. The empire he died trying to protect is still being taken apart in a federal courtroom. There's a particular kind of tragedy in the Miske story that goes beyond the usual crime boss gets caught arc, because those stories tend to end in a straightforward way, with a conviction, a sentence, and a clear sense of closure. This one ends differently. It sits in a space filled with ambiguity, legal technicalities, and the unsettling reality of a man who planned his own death with precision and still did not achieve what he intended. Miske built his empire on the belief that every outcome could be managed. For years, that belief seemed justified. Investigations stalled, leads went nowhere, and law enforcement efforts often fell apart in ways that made him look untouchable. Incidents like the failed searches and misread intelligence only reinforced that image. Over time, even those watching him closely began to question whether he could ever really be brought down. But there's a difference between being untouchable and being in control. And there's a difference between power and obsession. When Caleb died, Miske faced something he could not influence or contain. It was a loss that did not respond to pressure, planning, or force. Without any way to process that kind of powerlessness, he turned toward the one response he understood. His focus shifted to Jonathan Fraser, someone he believed he could hold responsible. Removing Fraser became a way to reassert control over a situation that had taken it from him. But that decision, driven by emotion rather than strategy, exposed everything. Fraser's disappearance drew attention that could not be contained. Ashley Wong refused to let the matter fade, and the investigation, which had struggled for years, gained direction through Wayne Miller's cooperation. Miller's decision to speak to authorities was influenced by his own fear, shaped in part by conversations with Miske himself. In trying to reestablish control, Miske created the conditions that allowed the case against him to finally take shape. And even at the end, the same pattern continued. His final attempt to influence the outcome, which investigators believe was carefully planned, may have produced the opposite effect. Authorities now argue that his death itself was part of a broader effort to interfere with the legal process, and that argument is being used to justify continuing the forfeiture of his assets. What was intended as a final move to protect what remained may ultimately contribute to its loss. His co-defendants are doing real time. Ronald Ching, the enforcer, facing decades. John Stansel, his stepbrother, pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, acknowledged his role in the kidnapping plot. Lance Bermudez admitted to participating in the kidnapping and murder of Jonathan Fraser, sentences ranging from 7 to 30 years. Jonathan Fraser's son is growing up without his father, Ashley Wong, who stood outside the courthouse after testifying and was called a hero, a woman who went up against the most powerful man in Honolulu's underworld and didn't blink because her love for Jonathan was stronger than her fear of what Miske could do. She's living with that absence every single day. And Delea, Caleb's wife, who pleaded guilty at the last moment to assisting the enterprise and was sentenced to 7 years, is raising their daughter from behind bars. At her sentencing, Miske's own biological daughter wrote a support letter for Delia that contained one of the quietest, most devastating lines in this whole story. She wrote, "I am close to my father, Mike Miske, and do love him. However, I recognize the power he has over people. Not fear, power. The gravitational pull of a man who made the people around him feel like his orbit was the safest place they could be, right up until the moment it wasn't. Michael Miske spent 50 years trying to become something that couldn't be touched. He built businesses, cultivated his image, bought loyalty, terrorized his enemies, and styled himself after the kind of men who get turned into myths. He wanted the Gotti story, the power, the swagger, the sense that the rules everyone else lived by just simply did not apply to him. What he got was a federal indictment, a 6-month trial, 13 guilty counts read aloud while his daughter sobbed behind him, and a cell he never walked out of. Hawaii's state motto, "Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono," translates roughly as, "The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness." Ashley Wong quoted it outside the courthouse after she testified. Then she added something of her own. "I want all of Hawaii to know that evil will not conquer." She meant it as a declaration. And it was. But it's also just an accurate description of what happened to Michael Miske. Not because the system was clean, not because justice came out perfect on the other side. The conviction got vacated. The man who ordered a murder died without ever being formally sentenced for it. The legal resolution is still messy, still contested, still playing out in civil courts as of this year. But the empire is gone. The assets are in dispute, the people who carried out his orders are in prison, and the man himself, the man who once told a rival, "Do you want to disappear in Hawaii?" Things happen here. He's the one who disappeared, not into the Pacific he loved, into a federal cell, alone, with nothing left to control and nobody left to protect him. He controlled the ending maybe, but he didn't get to write it. In the end, the man who spent his whole life controlling everything couldn't escape himself.